Welcome to the Humanists of Greater Portland Sunday morning meeting. I'm Helen Christians and I'll be your MC. I want to welcome those folks who are joining us through Zoom and those attending in person at Friendly House. The Humanists of Greater Portland is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. It's my belief that all the volunteers who make the Humanists of Greater Portland a vibrant organization is a true example of the power of humanism. Humanism is defined is an outlook or system of thought attaching primary importance to human experiences and the wonders of the natural world rather than the supernatural. Humanists value the worth and goodness of all human beings and seek to find common values and respect among people. Humanists stay curious and open as they seek rational ways to form a peaceful, equitable society by listening to others and speaking their own truth through the pillars of science, reason, and free inquiry. Our topic at today's meeting, public policy and the cult phenomena, especially addresses the humanist commitments of critical thinking, empathy, and personal responsibility. Joyce Lackey will be our reader this morning. Come on in, Joyce. Thanks so much for doing this for us.
Because tomorrow is a holiday of sorts, I looked for a good reading on Halloween. Then I realized that our speaker will be considering cults, and those are even spookier than ghosts and goblins. So here are some collected thoughts on the cult phenomenon. All cults are personality cults. All cults are really extensions of whoever the cult leader is. So whatever the prejudices, the worldview, and the ideas of the cult leader, they will be chanted back at him by the crowd. Until massive social and economic inequality, as well as the betrayal of the country by the elite, are confronted and remedied, this yearning for a cult leader will not go away. Desperate people are looking for somebody to save them. Chris Hedges. Some of the smartest people are also the most committed to falsehoods. Intelligence doesn't make you less prone to talking or to taking on bad ideas. It just makes you better at defending them. Smart people can believe some truly ridiculous things and then deploy all the reason and logic at their disposal to justify them, because a belief doesn't begin in your mind. It begins in your feelings. Jonathan Sims, archivist of the Magnus Archives in London. There are some phenomena commonly found in both cults and religions, at least in their early days. These include a strict differentiation of leader and followers, rebellion against established authority, paranoia as the new movement seeks to establish itself, simplistic, dualistic thinking, good versus evil, believer versus heretic, saved versus damned, and a tendency toward utopian thinking. Many followers tend to join in their teens or early 20s when they are still unformed adults, individuals not yet fully at ease in their own skins, seeking a sense of identity and security which the cult is able to provide. Kathleen Taylor, neuroscientist and physiologist. And lastly, isolating oneself into a narrowly defined victim group promotes a view of others as irrelevant at best and dangerous at worst, which eventually only leads to further alienation. Gangs, extremist political parties, and religious cults may provide solace, but they rarely foster the mental flexibility needed to be fully open to what life has to offer, and as such cannot liberate their members. Well-functioning people are able to accept individual differences and acknowledge the humanity of others. Bessel van der Volk, psychologist and trauma researcher.
Oh, Joyce, thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Yes,
I would now like to welcome our speaker, Lisa Kendall, who will be speaking today on public policy and the cult phenomena. Lisa has a master's in public administration with a focus on public-private partnerships. She grew up in the cult movement, the Move of God. Lisa has been active in the cult awareness community since 2012. She is the founder and director of Counterculture Coalition. She believes her education and her experience compel her to work for better public policy to allow children in cults more meaningful lives. Lisa lives with 3 marvelous cats in Portland, Oregon, and I just want to welcome Lisa. Thank you so much to talk about this very important topic.
Thank you for having me.
Mhm.
I do want to say it's Counter Cult Coalition.
Oh,
And
sorry.
No, it's so funny. Twitter, everything always changes it for me. I'm not counterculture.
No.
Anyway, so what I want to talk about today is the problem related to cults in our society, how it affects all of you without you realizing how expensive it is, and solutions for that. First, I do want to give you a brief overview of the counter cult world. There are 5 categories of cult. Most people have an expertise in a type of cult and then a method of engaging, such as in mediation, intervention, counseling, research. So my mother joined the Move of God when I was 9 years old. I was in from 9 to 19. That makes me a 2nd generation adult because I did not choose to join. Joiners are called first gens. So I'm an ex-Movite SGA, 2nd generation adult. And there are hundreds of former children from cults who work in the counter cult world. I specialize in Bible cults. There's an attorney I work with. Her specialization is civil suits regarding sexual abuse in Buddhist cults. So the area is so big, the issues are so complex that people specialize. And I'll say that because people often call me thinking I want to get involved in something where I have absolutely no expertise whatsoever. I've been using the term and the Facebook page Counter Cult Coalition for a decade. I finally decided to formalize it to have more support for my projects. We've been a tax-exempt nonprofit now since this last spring, Counter Cult Coalition. We have an all-volunteer board. We operate on less than $500 a year, and we are the only organization in the world who works on public policy. Most people do interventions or therapy or research. So I do want to explain the difference between a traditional religion and a cult. I've gotten some feedback from you guys in the past about that from HGP and CFI, which I totally get. But I want to say that for the people who grow up in cults, it can be frustrating when people say, well, all churches are cults. There's definitely a criteria for how you determine if an organization is a cult. Many religions are culty or cult-like. Many people from every kind of organization, even families, have people who are coercive. That doesn't make it a cult, that makes it culty or cult-like, people say. So a cult will control your behavior, information, your thoughts, and your emotions. Behavior as in movies, dancing, how you're dressed, information, newspapers, museums, education, secular books. None of that was allowed for me when I was growing up, and for the majority of the time in the cult, I grew up right here in Portland, Oregon. When I tell people I grew up in a cult, the 2 questions I get most often right off the bat are, where were your parents and where did you grow up? Which means, like, your parents wouldn't have allowed that, and it couldn't be here in Portland. So I will say there are cults everywhere. There are many horrific cults that have operated here in Portland, like the Children of God, or are currently. It is a very prevalent issue. It's far more widespread than people think. There are over 3,000 cults, according to experts, in the United States alone. We are one of the worst countries for dealing with cults for a number of reasons. I think part of it is our country is so big. France, Wales, England, Australia, so many other countries deal with it so much better than we do, which means they provide us a template for what we can do to address the situation. It is illegal to be a cult leader in France, England, Wales, Australia, and New Jersey. And right now, New York has anti-coercion a bill pending. It does not cover cults. You have to live with the person. So it's really a domestic situation. If this bill passes, we're planning to expand it to cults. So one of my board members is a law student in New York who I had the pleasure of actually meeting in person last September when I traveled throughout the East Coast. So getting on to the problem with cults, I do want to say that I am not trying to shock people. I'm not going to tell you the worst of it by any means. We are going to touch on some of the issues. And I see there's a child in the audience. Okay. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is due to the isolation in cults, some of the things that children and animals experience are, so far beyond what we could even imagine in most cases, that it perpetuates. We're not doing anything about it. For instance, in Amish communities, there is rampant sexual abuse, of course, physical, emotional abuse. The abuse of animals is terrible. The puppy mills are among the worst in the world in the Amish community. When the dogs are no longer bringing out profitable litters, they take them to dog auctions. You can auction off the dog. Breeders who'd like to get one more litter out of the dogs will take them in. They're usually disposed of. I'll say, I'm going to tone down some of my language since due to the audience today. So there's a child here. But, again, why do we allow that? And I want to tell you that I do not say anything publicly or even privately that isn't backed up by lots of documentation, because there's so much going on. There's no reason to. I've brought documentation about the puppy mills for anyone interested. You can easily go online and learn about the issue. Another problem is because of the restrictions on dating and romance in many cults, including the Amish, there is rampant sexual abuse of the most vulnerable people. We know from the Quiverful, it has come out publicly that the reason there is such an issue with incest and child abuse is the confusion over being told that any form of sexuality is bad. So if it's all bad and you're experiencing feelings, especially as a teenage boy, then you don't have appropriate outlets for it. You haven't been socialized to know how to deal with it. And so in the Quiverfuls, that's what it's about. In the Amish community, it's because they don't want the men to leave. So if you have boys, coming of age, going through puberty, there's so many reasons to leave. Amish boys love heavy metal music, and they listen to it when they're not on the farm. So if they have all of these draws, and then another one of them is the inability to express themselves physically, the little girls in the community take one for the team over and over and over. And the mothers either look the other way or tell their daughters that they have to do it. So the little girls are the solution for the rigid rules about dating in Amish communities. This has been very well documented by prosecutors. There's been many court cases, and many little girls coming forward and explaining how prevalent it is, how visiting another Amish home, you see it right there. It's so acceptable that you see it visiting your friends. You see the worst things you could imagine if you're a little girl. I did an interview on the podcast Critical and Thinking for Ian Harris. He's a friend of HGP and CFI. I don't know if anyone knows him. He is a very outspoken atheist, and he's a comedian. He does a lot of regarding politics. And we were talking about the issue of the little girls. And he said, well, why don't they just allow them to date women? And I said, because that would be a sin. And he just threw his hands up. And so it gave me a lot to think about with him asking a question to me that seemed ridiculous. Of course you can't do that. Of course it's better to be in denial and pretend like there is no issue while little girls are suffering than to upend your entire religion. So after this interview, which just threw me for a loop with reasonable questions he asked that in our world seem obvious. And so I talked to other female SGAs like myself, and we had an online chat. And I said, yeah, he said, why don't they just allow them to date women? And they're just like, what? That's ridiculous. Everyone said the same thing I did, because religion doesn't work that way. You're not just going to decide all of a sudden that you're going to address the tenets of your faith that your whole life is built on. Therefore, the abuse of animals and children is just increasing, I hate to say. The abuse of animals in the same way that children are abused, we call that bestiality. I hate that term. It's not bestiality, it's the sexual assault of animals. Some states call it carnal knowledge with an animal. Some call it sexual assault. It's becoming more common to call it sexual assault. In the Amish, because they're all about forgiveness, which is why so many people think they're just kind, peaceful people, that reputation the Amish have is how they want to see themselves. And it's what they tell their children they are. It's what they want the world to see. That is not what the Amish community is like, and many other groups like it. When men go out to the barn to spend time with the new baby ponies and baby calves, they will get up in front of the congregation and apologize and say, I went out and spent time with the pony. I don't know exactly how they put it. And they're forgiven. And then the children grow up hearing this and seeing this. And then they get the message that it's okay because their dad or their uncle or their grandpa keeps being forgiven for going out to the barn and enjoying the new baby calf. You know, whose responsibility is it to do something about this? The Amish aren't going to do anything about it. We need better oversight, and there are many ways to address these issues. One of the problems with the puppy mills, they're supposed to be inspected more often than they are. Many of the Amish puppy mills are not registered with the state, and there aren't enough people to inspect as frequently as the law requires in many places. And this is predominantly on the East Coast, by the way, where the puppy mills. The other things I'm talking about, I've never heard of a community that did not experience that. I recently looked into it, talked to a variety of people and said, can you just pinpoint which groups are doing this? Idaho, Nebraska, New York, it's just everywhere. And the children who grow up with the constant trauma are very expensive to society. So you are helping to pay for therapy, for prisons, for graves, for families who can't afford to bury the children who've committed suicides from cults. Unfortunately, this is far more common than you would probably think. So thank you all for supporting that. I would say it's less expensive to just prevent the abuse to begin with. So, you know, in addition to the intrinsic value of having children not grow up that way, my focus is on the children. There are other groups who've done other aspects. Rita Swan, who I met through the Free Thought Conference right here in Portland that HGP helped put on. She is a hero in the counter cult world. Her focus was on religion and medical neglect. There's another group on the East Coast that works with children and abuse in general, not cults. So it's so important that all of us work together. We need to work together with municipalities. We need to work with the federal government. We need nonprofits and volunteers from the community all working together. That's what Counter Cult Coalition does. Right now, we are compiling laws that have been used to prosecute cults and laws that more directly apply to cults. So for instance, in Kansas, cult leaders were prosecuted under the RICO laws. In California with Raniere and Nixon, that was human trafficking. In other ones, it's sexual assault or kidnapping. But coercion itself is not something we've really looked at. So for instance, as the world is better coming to understand domestic violence, and the attorney that I work with is an expert in domestic violence and learning about cults at the same time, because there's a lot of overlap there. It is illegal now in places like New Jersey to coerce someone. So if you are in a domestic relationship and someone is controlling you, telling you you can't go to work this day, you need to cut your hair or not cut your hair, or dress a certain way, you can't see your friends, and they're committing other forms of abuse, they would be prosecuted if we're talking about actual justice here. They would be prosecuted for the abuse and the coercion itself. The coercion itself can send someone to prison. And that's what the New York law has on the books right now. That doesn't apply to cults, but we want to expand to. Coercion is illegal in many places. People will often ask, well, how do you prove that? Because whenever there's a new idea, it's hard to grasp that we can wrap our arms around that. One of the things that they look at is the group coercing someone for the benefit of the group or the benefit of the leader? That's illegal. So if you can show that, for instance, when I was 17, I was underage. I was actually a ward of the state at the time too, because I had left my home and sued my mother to have her not have custody of me. Sadly, I went back to the cult when I was 17. I heard about this wonderful place from traveling ministry who came through in Grand Marais, Minnesota. I went there not knowing anything about it at 17. I was labor trafficked. When I got there, I said, I've been working since I was 12. I need a break. They said, no, you have to work. I worked 7 days a week at 17 when I should have been in high school. And they took half of my salary. There's no way I could ever have imagined I had a choice in the matter. I did menial work when I should have been in high school. And I was not allowed to read secular books. I couldn't do anything without permission. I had to have permission to walk down to the lake and back. And they didn't take care of my medical, dental, therapy, anything. They didn't pay for my glasses. Again, I was 17, I was a child. I could have sued. Under current laws and current understanding, I would be in a position to sue for labor trafficking, for coercion, for exploitation, for abuse. And so I'm wanting people to understand that you can prove that in many cases. With the Children of God, they're the hardest to prove. If you're not familiar with the Children of God, that's the organization that Joaquin Phoenix, River Phoenix, Rose McGowan, and many other famous people were in. The first drummer for the Fleetwood Mac, is that right, John? You would know. He is one of the worst child rapists in history. And he is still in the Children of God, which has changed their name to the Family International, because all over the world and so many countries, it's just unbelievable. The prosecutors, the police, private detectives were searching for the children to get them out of this group. It is called a pedophile cult for a reason. It was basically brothels of children. There was one right here in Portland. And they're able to go under the radar for so long. I didn't even know there was one here in Portland. Nobody I know, none of the counter cult people here in Portland knew. And so one of my board members lived here in that child brothel here in Portland, Oregon. And so did actually another woman, a friend of hers. And they say that there's probably still a house with the Children of God here. With the Children of God, they would take the children from their parents, move them around the world. Like you'd suddenly go to Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Switzerland, France, England, Greece. They were all over the place. And they mostly went to countries where there was less supervision, less oversight because of looser laws, or they didn't have the ability to investigate the way that we do here in the United States. So they ended up moving most of the operations out of the US. The children their names would be changed. They would never went to public school. Unless they had a private, very private yard, they were never allowed to leave the house. They couldn't go outside and play. This has all been very well documented because of the fact that they moved the children around, changed their names all the time. It was really hard for a parent who would leave over the abuse, would try to get custody of their child and not be able to find them. There's a book you can get that details some of this called Not Without My Sister that is available through the Multnomah County Library. I work with a number of people from the Children of God. I have to say I had a very vague understanding of what it was like until I read a couple of the books out about them. There are a variety of documentaries on the subject. Right now, some of the former children are working to prosecute the current leader. They can't find her. They believe that she was in Mexico last month. So, the former children of the Children of God have this amazing network where they go after the adults to prosecute them. And they have websites that document all of the suicides. they are the former children. I mean, every time I talk to them, there's been at least a new one. And these are the children they grew up with. River Phoenix said he lost his virginity at the age of 4 in the Children of God. Is that losing your virginity? And, Joaquin doesn't want to talk about that. I very much respect that. I very much respect that. But what I want to say is that these children growing up with this, most of them turn to drugs and alcohol, a lot of the girls to prostitution. I'm one of the luckiest ones. I have a master's degree. I've traveled through 22 different countries. I just got back from the beautiful Quebec City after traveling around the East Coast, and my life was completely ruined by a cult. And I'm one of the luckiest ones. I was not sexually abused in a cult, which is amazing, probably because I was this scrawny little girl with braces and glasses. Honestly, I really do think that's one of the reasons. As hard as that might be for some people to hear, and I get why you would say, well, it's not about what you look like, and there's some evidence to the contrary. Anyway, what I want to say is there are books on the subject. Buying the books, donating to some of the organizations that help people from cults, even $5 goes so far because there's no money in the arena. People don't care. They watch a documentary. They won't show up to fundraisers for this subject. They're less likely to contact their state representatives, their politicians, and those are the kinds of things that we need. Right now, we're working to affect legislation here along the West Coast that better protects children. Among the measures that we can adopt that other countries have shown us works are providing therapy for children who've left cults. That's not that hard. Many countries automatically offer medical care and mental health care for any children who can demonstrate they came from a cult. Also, some countries provided a monetary amount like $7,500 and therapy. Even China has better laws than we do. China, human rights violators, poster child for that. The United States needs to step it up. There are so many things that can be done. People often say, oh, it's against the law. Like that is all we need is the law. We need policy. We need laws that more directly address the issue based on the practices of specific cults. For example, in 2008, Harry Reid called the FLDS a criminal organization, organized crime. And he wanted women from the FLDS to be able to come forward. So what he did was offer childcare for women so they could testify against the men. And I hate to say it, but it's usually the women testifying against the men. I've never heard of a man testifying against a woman in the FLDS. Not that abuse doesn't happen by any demographic, including by women, but I just want to explain why I'm using certain very specific demographics in describing this. The women leaving the FLDS struggled to leave. Their children always had to be left behind. The FLDS has so much control. So Harry Reid did a number of things, creating panels. This is in 2008. When women tried to escape and went to the police and the local towns in Dry Creek, you might have heard of, in the border between Utah and Arizona, when girls would try to flee when they're being forced to marry someone, often they were never seen from again. And you can see videos online of the men walking around with guns to make sure the girls couldn't leave. They never kept the boys in, they kept the girls in. So when girls tried to leave more recently, a tracker would be put on their cars when they thought they might want to run. So there are 2 different nonprofits in Utah alone that help girls escape. 2 nonprofits, because it's that common. Right now today, some girl is trying to leave. So if somebody from the nonprofit goes out, they look for the tracker around the girl's car. They tell the girl, get your ID and your computer, because normally they're taken and hidden. And then luckily a law was passed there specific to that cult that allows the people assisting the girl and it has to only be a child trying to escape forced marriage. So there are 3 days before you have to tell the parents where the child is. In that 3 days, they're able to get her emancipated, file the papers for emancipation, get her to a safe house, and she goes on to choose when she wants to marry and whom. Just this one simple law has saved so many girls' lives. And that's why public policy is what we need to look at. Understanding the cult, understanding what's possible, knowing how to work with legislators. That's what is so important to me and why I feel compelled to do this. One of the things that they do here in Washington County is if there are 6 or more unrelated children in a household, someone has to come out and interview the family, investigate, however you want to put it, get eyes on the kids. These are things where you don't have to say it's about religion. You don't have to challenge someone's religious beliefs. It's like, oh, there's 6 people, 6 children who are not related to each other in one household. There's just so many things we can do to protect children in cults and animals. We need better oversight. If we know that the Amish community has an issue with visiting the pony and the calf in the barn, maybe those are the communities we need to focus on more with inspections. So there are a number of ways that can be addressed. One of the problems with prosecuting the Amish is that the boys are they're so poorly socialized, and they're so isolated from the community that judges don't want to send them to prison. And judges have said, this person needs to go to prison, but they'll just be eaten alive in there. And as the legal support for my nonprofit has explained to me on podcasts we've done, the problem with that is the person goes back into the community and then they're able to direct the narrative. Oh, the law is totally okay with me doing this to my daughter. Or, see, God is higher than the courts. The courts couldn't do anything to this. So, the majority of ways that people find out about what's happened to the girls, other than them leaving and doing interviews or writing books, is that these little girls are showing up pregnant in doctors' offices. And so there's a case you can read online where a little girl, and she was 12 years old, showed up pregnant at the doctor's office. The doctor asked, how did this happen? And she said, well, I've been having sex with my brothers. And so the family, I haven't heard today if they know which one of the brothers fathered the child. So it turned out all 6 brothers were, and only the oldest ones over 18 were prosecuted. They were not sent to prison. They were told that they had to follow just a few simple steps, including a kind of a diversion program. Because the Amish don't respect the laws of the land, they don't follow the judge's rulings, and therefore they do end up in prison. So that's the good thing about that. But there's been there have been so many cases of men being sent back into the communities where they perpetuated, and again, it just supports the narrative that it's okay. So I'm hoping, as hard as this is to hear, I'm not even telling you the bad stuff. If you can imagine being that pony or that child, is that how you want to live your life? I just read yesterday a little girl's account of growing up and how she would stare at the ceiling and she would count every crack in the ceiling, and she would just, and some of them saying, and as in this little girl, I became a different person. I numbed myself. I created a different person so it wasn't happening to me. And that's one of the problems with religion, is that slippery slope of you have to believe, you can't doubt, you have to have faith. It's all faith and not reason. And when that is such a big part of mainstream culture, including things that we're hearing in our public schools funded by our tax dollars, then for those people who are wanting more, they want more community, they want more meaning in their life, they want, more support, they want to be valued. Going from a church to a cult it's not as shocking as somebody might think to join a group where all of these things are happening. And I really appreciate that reading where you explain why people are looking to be saved. My mother was looking to be saved. My mother was raped. That's how I was conceived. Her life was so difficult. Abortion wasn't legal at the time. And, to understand why people join, my mother was so miserable and so ashamed of being a single mother in the 60s. She had so much shame around that. And the cult gave her meaning and told her she was special. So we as a community, one of the things we can do is be more of a support, be more compassionate, more understanding, a little bit kinder, more supportive of the vulnerable people in our communities, and inoculating people against cults, talking about it. I do want to say real quick, because it's so important to know, if you know someone, or if someone knows someone who has joined what you believe to be a cult, you want to make sure that you never criticize the cult. That's not how you get them out. You say very friendly things. You are very, very neutral. Ask about what they've been doing lately, their animals, whatever, and then ask questions. Just occasionally ask a question about the dogma, about the group. It has been proven to plant seeds that help people leave. I know this has been really scattered. I've just wanted to throw a whole bunch of information at you. I want to create activists in the community, people who care about the issue, people who watch the documentaries, and then will maybe make a phone call and leave a message on your state representative's phone line. You don't get a cookie unless you ask for it. And the problem with SGAs, we haven't been asking for it. So that's my mission right now, is we are the next human rights movement. And we do need the support of the community. A quick phone call, letter to the editor in a newspaper, donate $5 to an organization, donate $5 to my organization. Help us with our website. There's a lot you can do to help. So thank you so much for having me. I want to open it up for questions.
Okay, very good. Lisa, thank you. And a lot to think about that there. We do have a question here from Kathy in Vale Humble. Could you give a clear definition of what a cult is? How would you define specifically a cult?
Well, I look to what the researchers used as the criteria. There are several different ones. They're all very similar. In the counter cult world, we have done so much discussing and debating and researching that most things in our world are widely believed. So it's not my beliefs, it's the belief of the counter cult world. Steve Hassan, who you might see on CNN talking about cults from time to time, he's a member of our community. He uses the BITE model, where it's behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions. So if an organization shuns you or makes you feel unacceptable if you do things that they don't like, that is a type of coercion. That's the coercion I experienced. So for instance, with clothing, I remember when I was 12, somebody from the Move saw me in Portland, Oregon. I was like near Powell Boulevard. I still remember so clearly. I was wearing these cool black and white checked pants, actually similar to these, but they weren't, there was a much bigger pattern. I must really like that. Anyway, somebody saw me and I was petrified. I was mortified. I was so shamed. I was 12-year-old wearing pants. So that's, when people want to talk about the difference between a church and a cult, you're not going to be shunned by everybody in your Catholic church if you use birth control, even though it's against their tenets. And they don't control how you dress, what you read, what kind of information you take in, what your entertainment is. In terms of behavior, some of that is about isolation, not being able to know people outside of the cult. The Children of God, for instance, they believed that all gay people were pedophiles and they were afraid to go to the bathroom in public. They were just sure someone was going to march in and harm them. And so I don't know how to answer that question any more than that it is about them controlling your life in ways that you don't even agree with. I didn't agree that I couldn't wear pants. When I was 17, I had a phobia of sharks, obviously because I was in a cult and I was miserable. And somehow I knew I needed exposure therapy. I went to a library and I got the book Jaws, and I got a book about shark attacks, and nonfiction book. I had to hide them under my pillow in the dorm room with the bunk beds where I slept. Well, at that point, I was forced to give 3/4 of my salary. I had to hide books. And actually, at that point, I was 18. I think I had turned 18, and I couldn't even read books without the permission of the community, which would have meant the Bible and only religious books. I don't know. I don't know how to better answer that question.
It was very well done, Lisa. Thank you. I think Mike Boucher has a question from Friendly House. Come on in, Mike.
You talk about passing laws to restrict cults, like in New Jersey. Now, with the current makeup of the Supreme Court, who are all for religious freedom and all that, you feel a greater danger of these cults hiring slick lawyers to take advantage of the current Supreme Court makeup and twist rulings in their favor?
That's a good question. And actually, the legislation that people in my community have worked on, such as Rita Swan coming to Oregon, making it illegal to not take your child to the doctor if you know your doctor is suffering life-threatening medical issues. They're done on the state level. I would like to see federal legislation in the future, maybe if we have a different Supreme Court. Cults already hire slick lawyers. They spend a lot of money on attorneys. It is very scary going up against a cult. I'm sure you've heard about Scientology and how the lawsuits. Scientology actually sued the Cult Awareness Network out of existence. So I know people who were part of CAN, the Cult Awareness Network. Scientology sued them, and among other things, they got all of the files from CAN that included their own former members who had left and people were thinking of leaving. So if someone's thinking of leaving Scientology, there's a file on it. Scientology would get that file and then go after those people and try to get them to stay. So that's just one example of many. It is a huge problem. I did 2 radio interviews with KBOO. After the first one, the Move of God wanted to sue me and KBOO. They really scared KBOO because they were collecting money from all over the world. The Move that I grew up in, it was active in 30 countries when I was a teenager. It's active in 15 today. You probably haven't even heard of it. And yet they have spent so much money fighting in the courts. And I have worked directly with amicus briefs and providing information to adult protective services, child protective services in those cases. But you're right, it is a huge problem when you look at, excuse me, the Supreme Court today and the money they have for attorneys.
It's like the religious freedom of the children, called members, is totally thrown under the bus.
The Convention on the Rights of the Child addresses that. We are the only country, the only signer that has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that provision would allow for children to be able to determine their own belief systems, in addition to being allowed an education, not being labor trafficked, among other things. So that, again, is the solution. The Convention on the Rights of the Child would address some of what you've brought up. I will say with the case with KBOO and the Move of God, it was so scary. They were constantly writing and calling and emailing KBOO. So they pulled the first interview when we did a second one. And it was like just one little thing I had to leave out just so that they would quit harassing us. Well, actually, they kept harassing me. Luckily, there's a lot of the people who organize cults are not very organized. So the teenager who had set up their email accounts, they'd never changed the password. And so she had left. Years after she left, she was able to read their emails. So she knew how they were collecting money. She also knew that they said they were afraid to sue Lisa Kendall because of what would come out. Funny anecdote, I grew up being told, you'll never know who the Antichrist is. It's someone who would just surprise you. And in 2014 in Alaska, they said over the pulpit in a Move of God community, Lisa Kendall is the Antichrist. So it was someone I didn't expect at all. They were right.
Let's see, we have just a clarification from Val. Um, is a cult defined by coercion? Is that the primary? And Val, come on in and add a little bit to that if you wish to.
There isn't much to add. It isn't really clear to me why a church is not a cult, and just exactly what makes a thing a cult.
Well, the level of coercion is so different. You can go to church, to a Catholic church or a Protestant church or a Baptist church, and then you can have a life outside of the church. No one is telling you, abandon your family, the world is about to end. I grew up being told, let the dead bury the dead, and not engaging in mainstream society. I understand that, many churches are coercive, but the level of coercion is the difference is so vast. I mean, we had a television set when I was growing up, and my mother excused it, saying, well, the kids are home alone. And it was a point of discussion in the move. I went to someone's house one time and saw a Christmas tree. I couldn't believe it. I was 12 years old. I still remember standing there staring at their tree, wondering, what in the world do they think they're doing? It permeates so many areas of your life. There's almost total control. In many cults, it's sleep deprivation. They have you so active in the community that you don't have time to think. You don't have time to have a life outside of the group. And if you're not meeting people outside of the group, that becomes your entire community. And as Michael Shermer explained in his book, The Believing Brain, you tend to believe what everyone around you believes. And so in a cult, even with these crazy ideas you don't even believe, you kind of sometimes halfway believe them. At least that's the experience for me and many other people I know. Whereas in a church, you're free to say, you can be in the Catholic community, be a member of a Catholic church and say, I don't think there's anything wrong with taking birth control, and so I do. Nobody's going to kick you out of the church or shame you or shun you. Does that answer the question?
Yes. What do you think, Val? Does that help?
I think it does confirm that it is about coercion.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I had always thought that cult needed to have a cult leader and he needed to be charismatic, but that seems to be not a part of it all.
Well, that is the thinking among many people, is that there has to be a charismatic leader. First of all, Sam Fife was not charismatic. A lot of cult leaders are not charismatic. David Berg, head of Children of God. But there also are communities that are completely leaderless. One of them is called, Church of Christ. They have communities all over. They don't have one leader. And, so there's a variety of models for a cult. I mean, there's coercion everywhere. Sales is a form of coercion in many cases, but the level of coercion in a religious community, I would say, is stronger than what we normally see in mainstream communities. And then cults are far beyond that because they're exploiting you. If your pastor is forcing you to work for free for him or coercing you for money or sex, they can be run out. In a cult, that's not typically how it works. Often they're promoted.
We have a question from Willie. Would Christian Science be considered a cult where they don't follow modern medicine, is my understanding of Christian Science?
They're absolutely a cult. So Rita Swan, who again I met from our wonderful local free thought community, when she grew up in she grew up in Christian Science. All of her community was Christian Science. At 19, when she had a baby, her baby had spinal meningitis. She wanted to take her baby to the hospital. She was told, the baby is sick because of your faith. You don't have enough faith. And if you take your baby to the hospital, we will excommunicate you. She would have lost all of her friends and family. She wrote a memoir called The Last Strawberry, but the last strawberry she fed her baby as it died in her arms. And she then devoted her life to passing legislation requiring people to take their children to the doctor if they knew that they were suffering a serious medical issue. partly so that the people in the church could say, oh, I'm so sorry, I have to follow the law. Because so many times the church is not allowing the parent to take their child to the doctor. And in regard to that, I want to say I do have some literature up here about, I have a couple of Rita Swan's newsletters. You can find them online. She came to Oregon to pass legislation we didn't know we needed. She has saved thousands of babies in the followers of Christ in Oregon City, Milwaukee, West Lynn. Even those parents are still going to prison. But thanks to her legislation and our attorney general calling up and saying, listen, I don't want to prosecute you guys, so I'd like you to start taking your kids to the doctor. You know, they often, like many cults, they don't register their children when they're born. They don't get a social security number. So the only way to track the number of deaths is to go through their cemetery, which volunteers occasionally do, go through the cemetery, take down names and date of birth so that we can find some of the, I just hate to say this strongly as I am with a broad audience, but I mean, we're talking about dead babies. And many people's lives are completely ruined from lack of medication, lack of medical care in the children of, in the followers of Christ. You can look on Rita Swan's website, just put in child and swan, they'll pop up, and you can see how devastating the effects of that belief system and the coercion in that group is. I'm sorry, it's hard for me not to tell stories. I want people to know.
I could ask you a question.
We have a question from Friendly House.
Hi there. First of all, it's disheartening to talk about this aspect as just being a matter of degrees of coercion. You know, just should be none of it at all.
Oh,
so
I agree.
It's very disheartening.
Thank you.
And also the obvious patriarchal, let's face it, there's a lot of that happening in terms of the control of women and girls. I mean, when you talk in the 90 percentile, probably the high 90 percentile, that's an aspect of it that's just prevalent as well that we need to address, but that is what it is. I just wanted to know, them calling themselves church of and this and imbuing the Christ and the this and the that, are cults, as you're specifying, do they get tax exempt status? Are they able to, in some ways, as you say, the litigation part of it is lessened because sort of nobody wants to sort of touch the privacy aspect or the, you know, seeing them as some sort of a valid religious organization? I'm just wondering what kinds of.
So it's all over the map. So many cults get nonprofit status, including the Move of God. So it was a registered nonprofit when I was a member as a child. All the more reason to be able to sue. I know that, excuse me, I can't remember who it was just revoked, was it France, just revoked Scientology's nonprofit status. It's been gone after in many different places in many ways with different organizations, but most of them retain their nonprofit status. So that can be better for prosecution, yes.
Right. Okay.
But you can still be registered and not have nonprofit status. So, you know, that's one of the things we need to go after. The one difference between cults and churches, like I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Jerry Falwell scandal, the pool boy and all the money they gave him.
Back
And
in the news again, yeah.
yeah, and I just heard, was it today, somebody said, you go to New York when you want to be somebody. No, excuse me, you go to LA when you want to be somebody. You go to New York when you are somebody. You go to Miami when you want to be somebody else. So Jerry Falwell, under the radar somehow for years, but when it came up enough, which usually means several people have to complain about it loudly for a church to do something about it, but he was disgraced and removed. In most cults, the person who has been found to be committing crimes are moved around. And we're talking about the worst crimes like Jerry Spencer, or whatever his name is. For Jeremy Spencer, from, you know, they just move them around, which is what the Catholic Church does. But that's more about protecting the organization than about the overall structure of the religion. But I would say that the Catholic Church is very interested in preserving the Catholic Church. Cults are very interested in preserving themselves. And so they'll say, like when we were growing up, we were told the mission, the end, that the most important thing, we have better things to focus on than whether or not that 4-year-old girl just experienced that. I mean, but that's what we grew up hearing.
Okay,
And
let's
again,
see,
I'm
we
not
have
even telling you guys the shocking things, really. I mean, like the wife of the leader of the move, when one 4-year-old girl came forward, she said, oh, she must have enjoyed it. And people who heard that still talk about it today. You know, decades later, people talk about how frustrating it was to try to do something about the worst forms of abuse.
we have a question from Al Christians, who's sitting right beside me.
Yes, one thing I wanted to ask you about is, the last 3 years we've had lots of kids not going to school because of this pandemic. And I wonder if that is a stepping stone towards membership in a cult. Kids stay home and they get kind of detached from school, and then the parents figure, well, this kid was not really in school, so we'll homeschool them now. And then when their kid's not going to school and they're having trouble finding out what to do to keep the kid occupied, they may join some kind of a church group or some kind of local organization that's recruiting members and so on. And all of a sudden you wind up with the kid being raised, either by crazy parents or by a cult. Do you see any increase in this problem over the last few years with all this stuff about being detached from society through the computer?
Yeah, it's interesting you said that for a couple of reasons. When COVID hit, a lot of people were really worried because, for one thing, people would be home, so people could knock on your door and recruit you. Also, this year's theme for the International Cultic Studies Association's conference in Kentucky, in Louisville, Kentucky, is cults in the time of COVID and how COVID affects cults. Not something I know anything about at all. I'm hoping to present at the conference on a different subject, even though that's the theme. And by the way, there are lots of anti-cult workshops right here in Portland, all over the country, and one international conference every year. So, I mean, again, the movement, the counter-cult movement is wide and deep.
I have a question. You mentioned the FLDS, which I'm not sure quite what those initials stand for, but what is the difference between them, the FLDS, and if you tell us what the name of that is, and the LDS Church, which I think is the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, but why is one a church and the other a cult?
I think the Mormon Church is very cult-like. Personally, I would call it a cult. A lot of people in our world might find it not quite there. I definitely find the Mormon Church a cult. The FLDS, completely different. So when Utah or the federal government decided, okay, polygamy is now illegal, some people who wanted to continue practicing polygamy broke off. And they broke off into a very isolated, very abusive, very exploitive community, the FLDS. I can't remember, what does that stand for? The F in, I can't, oh, that's right, thank you. So it's LDS, Latter-day Saints. So it's the fundamentalists, going back to the fundamentals of their religion, which how the families are structured in the FLDS, the women make money and they have to give it to the man. The man is the head of the wife. He's not only the head, every single thing she has belongs to him. She has nothing. So she has to go out and work and then give him her money. And then she has no money for hairspray for those big updos they do. It takes a lot of hairspray. And so the women steal each other's shampoo and hairspray. And so the one who would steal it will say, well, it doesn't belong to you anyway. It belongs to father, which is often what they call their husband. So there's a lot of suffering with these women, so much pressure to be able to somehow keep your hair up, but nobody gives you money for hairspray. And then if you find a way to get a little bit of money for hairspray, with a little bit of an allowance you get, and someone steals it, I mean, it's just one example and one ridiculous example of how oppressive that community is. And that's one of the ones where they chase the boys off because the men, and I wish I were exaggerating, but 60, 70-year-old men, 80-year-old men marrying 12 and 13-year-old girls. So the first wife they marry is their own age, and they, as the men age, they keep getting younger and younger wives, which is interesting because the first wife might be 18 when they're 18, but then when they're 50, they have to have a 12-year-old. again, why we have to help these girls leave.
Okay.
So the FLDS is very similar to the Kingston. It's also an offshoot of the Mormons, but with the Kingstons, you can wear makeup and you can wear more traditional or maybe more mainstream clothing. If you're not familiar with it, there's a documentary you can see on television. It's a tiny bit hyped, but it's like 90% of it is real. It's a little bit like a reality show. It's called Escaping Polygamy. I've seen every episode. I know some of the people who have worked with the girls, and that is a group of former Kingstons who help girls leave the cult.
We have a question in Friendly House from Kay. Kay, come on in.
You were just talking about money, and you mentioned that money was contributed to these cults from all over the world. That just seems so improbable. How they would get enough money from all of this, and how the people in the cults can even work at jobs that get them very much money. It's that it sustains itself is amazing.
You know, you brought tears to my eyes. One, in many cults, people are required to sell their house and give all their money because it's communal. In the Move of God, we had farms all over the world. We still have thousands of acres and a sawmill in Alaska, restaurants, inns.
People had to give them.
Right. And then you work and all of that for free. And then if you choose to leave, you've invested for many people several decades, and they walk away with no money, no education, nothing. The last person standing gets the farm. And so just last week, a woman from, actually one of my board members grew up in the same cult I did. And I didn't even know that because the counter cult are so big. I just said, finally, what group did you grow up in? You know, oh, the Move of God. She was upset because she had visited Meadowland in Minnesota, and this one very influential family of elders, should say the married couple were elders and their children, they got the farm for a song. And after all these people had cleared roads and put in buildings and gardens, and we're talking hundreds of acres. In the Children of God, in that case, the children were required to go out and sing and dance and entertain for money. And they would go to restaurants and sing and dance, especially around the holidays. And they would see people, they still talk about it today, see people eating when they were hungry. They would go to bed without food all the time. They had so little money. So the children, instead of it costing money to raise the children didn't go to public school. They had no entertainment. They didn't get proper medical care. They didn't have very many clothes. They didn't have toys. They weren't allowed to read books. You hear stories today of like, I hit a book when I was 16. I read a book. And they're not being fed. And so they're out there working for it. That's part of why River and Joaquin and Rose McGowan, why there's so many famous people from cults and from the Children of God specifically, because they grew up having to entertain the public for money. The women in the Children of God were required to go out and do flirty fishing, supposedly to save men from hell. They would go to bars in hotels. This is all very, very well documented.
Prostitutes.
Yes.
Become prostitutes.
So then they were required to go out. And
They
so
got
like my
money.
friend Jemima, I've asked her, how did you forgive your mother? And she's like, well, she was out busy flirty fishing. So she didn't know how badly I was being physically and sexually abused in the cult. So the women were told they had to do this. They would bring in money through. And then I recently found out they would send children out to bring in money that way. With one group, I forgot the name of it. They're nicknamed the Garbage Gourmands. Their leader told them that dumpsters were there provided by God so that you could find food. And so in that group, they all ate out of dumpsters. My friend Jemima, who is on my board, the treasurer, she talks about how because she was the older child and it was easier for her to get in the dumpster, her dad would take her out dumpster diving and she'd have to jump in and crawl around and look for food. They also went to food banks. So even when she's desperately in need of help, when she has medical issues, she won't go to a food bank. So I'm just saying there's
Yeah, you talk about the money available for lawyers. So I'm wondering, do they use the farms they have confiscated as collateral, and do the banks cooperate?
they don't confiscate farms, they buy them. And again, you have people working for free who don't, you're thinking about a life that costs the kind of money in your mind. If you're working and you're not having any entertainment, you're not getting clothes and all the things people have, you don't have a car, you only need to bring in $5,000 a year for yourself to survive. But the reason I mentioned Jemima and her issue today is that those forms of bringing in money have traumatized these children. And today we're dealing with the effects of that in our society through our tax dollars.
Thank you.
And some groups, even today with the Children of God, which is now called the Family International, they sell pamphlets to people. They go on the street and they'll sell pamphlets for like $1. Just garbage stuff. And people would pay for it just to, how you might give somebody $1 for something you don't care what it is, not knowing you're funding a cult.
Suzanne has a question. Suzanne, come on in. You're on Zoom.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa, for opening that door for us to realize. For me personally, I didn't realize that Oregon and Portland is certainly a spot, a hotbed, maybe. I don't know if that's the right word. So it made me think, well, how would I know if I were to see this? Because I like to interact with kids and, in the park or whatever. And of course, we probably wouldn't be seeing these kids out playing, except maybe in a group or something. But what if we were to discover or to suspect that?
There are many, many books on this subject. I'm sorry I'm doing such a bad job answering your guys' questions. A lot of the questions you ask are outside of my area of expertise or things I have never been asked before and haven't thought about, believe it or not. In regard to there's so many books out there about how to recognize if somebody is potentially involved in a cult. Their behavior changes, clothing changes, the same things that we see when someone gets radicalized in the terrorist movements like the Taliban. You recognize it, and by the way, that is a cult. The Taliban is a cult. All of those terrorist groups. And if you didn't know it, white supremacist groups, those are cults, and we address that in our world. For the people who want to leave, they can kill you sometimes. People have to hide the fact that they are no longer a racist. I don't know how else to put it. They hide, like if you have a film with a black actor in it, you would put it in a cassette that says your child's birthday party, knowing nobody would ever look at it. Things like that. So there's a lot of coercion in a wide range of different kinds of groups. And so you might recognize that if somebody starts behaving differently, their social world shrinks. They no longer engage in the same activities. My family knew I was in a cult. I was surprised when my aunt years later was like, "Oh, that cult you grew up in." And nobody ever talked to my mother about it. They could have come to me and planted seeds to help me understand that I didn't believe that. Like, if you don't believe something, you don't have to be there. Those are the kinds of things someone could have said to me. But there are experts who deal with this. As I said before, the main thing is keeping people in your life, maintaining contact with them, sending an email occasionally, a card, never criticizing the group, ever. All it does is cause people to go deeper. Instead, to just ask the occasional question, "Oh, what is this based on? How come you can't wear pants? How come you're not allowed to dance or go to movies? Or what is that about?" In a non-judgmental way, of course.
There is a question from Todd Kimball. Todd, can you come in? He's on Zoom.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Lisa, for the presentation. You've addressed a little bit about this in the last couple of minutes in your answers, so the question might be a little outdated, but would one way be of shutting down cults? Do people ever infiltrate them and try and shut them down from the outside?
Well, shutting them down is almost completely impossible. Even in the FLDS, Warren Jeffs is in prison, and most of the people, as they leave the group, when they acknowledge the abuse happened, think he's going to get out of prison and think that he was wrongly charged. So even when they're prosecuted, it doesn't tend to change things. But in regard to infiltrating, there have been some really interesting stories. One of the ones you can read is in the book I told you about earlier, Not Without My Sister, that you can get at the Portland library. There was a woman, one of the authors of the book, one of the three sisters, met a woman who was worried about her daughter who had recently joined the Children of God. and this was decades ago. She figured out a way to get in the door by meeting them in a park, pretending to be new in town. They looked for vulnerability. Oh, I'm new here. I don't know anybody. And so she was able to get into the house they had there. I don't remember if that was Switzerland or France. I can't remember. And I think it was Switzerland. And she was able to get in. She found out that this woman's daughter was pregnant. And by her going in and being able to show that the daughter was pregnant, she helped the mother get custody of her granddaughter, who would have been raised in the children of God otherwise. Yeah, there's lots of stories out there. I'm actually writing a memoir myself called No Place Like Home. And I'm happy to share a chapter or two with people if anybody's interested online.
So my question is kind of piggybacking off of a couple questions ago. I come from an LDS family. I have 7 brothers and sisters. So I'm very familiar.
Did I offend you?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Yeah, I am very familiar with the kind of like mentality around like the way that people think about and kind of
He's
edit
fine.
their
Totally fine.
like edit their thoughts around things, and that there are lots of defense mechanisms built into like how they respond. So like my question is like, when you're trying, if you think that somebody is involved with the cult, do you know of good resources for like how to ask good questions, or how to not like trigger them in a way where they'll feel unsafe and kind of break that relationship? Because there are a lot of things where like you might be asking an innocent question and they'll look at it as this person is attacking me now, and they'll shut down.
You're absolutely right. Totally outside of my area of expertise, but there are lots of great books on the subject. Steve Hassan is one of the people who have written about this. There's been a lot of research to find out what works. I can give some links for such books, and then you can find it through Friendly House, or through HGP. But yeah, there are people who train people to is that exactly the right word? There are lots of people you can go to and either pay money for them to help you interact with somebody. That's called mediation, intervention. There are 2 separate categories that are linked. Again, I'm not going to speak to this very well because I know nothing about it, but I know that there are books you can read. There's lots of online resources. There's lots of workshops. The International Cultic Studies Association's conference this year, which can be done online. Also, they almost always have a workshop on that. It only costs, I think, $150 for the conference. And there's usually about 100 speakers, might be only 80 this next year because of COVID, everything is smaller. But you can, do that online, then you can get recordings to listen to them afterward. And I'll pass on links for the book. But the main thing is absolutely don't criticize the group. Know how to ask a question, knowing your relationship with that person. As you just said, you can ask the most innocuous question and somebody will feel attacked.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Well, and I think that, Lisa, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you so much for a very enlightening presentation. It's a
Thank you
hard
very
topic.
much.
It's a hard topic to speak on.